All right. Well, I'm excited to have Dr. Luke Stein today on Coffee with Dr. A. Luke, thank you for being here. I'm excited to learn more about your career, but I'm also interested in learning about your transition to online education. From Twitter, you've been an advocate for using tech effectively when teaching online. And I'm actually dying to know more about your setup and what your students see from their standpoint. So today's conversation is just to know more about your tech views and how to transition effectively to this online teaching world. So Luke, thank you for being here.
It's really a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation and we've been having what feels like an ongoing conversation on Twitter, on YouTube, on Instagram. I've been learning a lot from you. It's been fun to feel like this conversation started a few months ago, but that we get to pick it up in this format. So thanks.
Yes, I think we first started talking in or exchanging ideas in the summer when life kind of changed for all educators, and we were sharing tips. And you've been a huge advocate for people that know that they need to do something differently with respect to their tech setup, but they don't know where to get started. So we'll tackle those tips. But before we get there, one thing that I really want to know about you, I try not to introduce people because I don't want to I want to allow people to define who they are. So how do you tell the world who you are, Luke?
So I am an economist. I'm a financial economist. It's not that I always define myself by my job, but it's kind of the easy way to start. And so I teach now at Babson College, which Babson is a really interesting school and a really unique one. Been at Babson for almost a year and a half now, and I joined Babson from Arizona State University. So I moved from a large public research university in Arizona to Babson, which is a smaller, largely undergraduate, business-focused college. And in some ways, what's really cool about the model at Babson, and I think makes it such a great place for me, is it's a business school, but it's a business school that also has some kind of liberal arts college blood flowing through its veins. And part of that is just about the size of the school and the sort of the campus model, which is a largely residential and largely undergraduate focused business school. So I sort of came there from a very different place, and I'm a research economist. So my research work is sort of centered around the intersection between labor economics and corporate finance. My training is not graduate school training is not in finance. I was trained in an economics department, and my PhD advisor, Nick Bloom, is a guy who has sort of an extremely diverse set of research interests and sort of places where he's done work. And that was part of, I would say that rubbed off on me. It's also what sort of helped me match with him as a student advisor. And so, my work sort of centers around that labor finance intersection, but also I have some work which, has a more purely economics feel to it, including some work in economic history. And then I have some work that, that also has a more purely finance feel, including, a little bit of asset pricing research. So on the research side, I sort of, that's the center for me, is that labor corporate finance intersection. But it goes off in a couple of different directions, including, a research agenda around racial discrimination and stratification more generally, and then some sort of history interest, and then some more traditional finance topics. So that's kind of my research life. It connects to some of these more teaching oriented topics in kind of an interesting way. So at ASU, I would say, I really was, I was doing both, and I continue to do both. But in terms of the way I approached my teaching, I wasn't drawing as explicitly on my research background in thinking about my teaching. And, my research agenda wasn't, oriented towards or organized towards my teaching in any way. It was kind of, I did both. Yeah. And I do think that, at Babson, I'm sort of excited to look for more ways. I've had more chances, for example, to talk about, my research to students in the classroom in the last year or year and a half. than I had before. And part of that is about the transition to Babson, for sure. But part of it is also really about opportunities that the move to online
Yeah.
has had. And so, there are guest classes that I've been able to do, or seminars that I've been able to do, which are research seminars, but research seminars that include a student audience, that are not necessarily opportunities that would have made sense either for me or for the people inviting me in a world where, you're talking about flights and hotel rooms. For better or worse, our profession is not one that's necessarily organized around, people flying across the country to talk to an introductory undergraduate class
True.
about, a peer-reviewed paper in a finance journal. And yet, like, that's the kind of stuff that I've been able to do in the last year because, I'm ready to talk about this work. I love it. I'm excited about it. But when it's a question of $0 and, a few hours prep and an hour or hour and a half on Zoom, there's a lot of greater opportunities that are available in that world than would have been available in a world where you sort of were asking people to take, 2 days and a few $1,000s of institutional money to bring them into the room.
And that's a great segue to an article that I read today about. It was a request for conferences to go back to in person because there's some conferences that are debating if they should remain online or have a component of it online, or go back 100% to in person when life gets back to normal, whatever that is. And I found myself torn by that because I know I've had more opportunities in the past year to attend conferences that I previously couldn't, financially couldn't afford them. We don't have the research budgets that research institutions have. And then time-wise, I mean, at a teaching institution, my teaching load is 3-3, so you can't get away from the classroom. And then, like you said, the marginal cost of inviting somebody is much lower now. So I'm making these pop-up appearances. So I'm torn. And with respect to conferences, I miss the social aspect of conferences, but I'm able to attend more conferences and present at more conferences. So we're like that calculus, the trade-off. I'm not sure where it is.
I think
what are your thoughts?
I think it's a really good and really, really hard question. Like so many things about our jobs, conferences are kind of a weird bundle. And, that bundle partly exists because of just kind of historical accident. And partly it exists because there's some cross subsidy. And so, there's the goal of the conference and the experience of the conference includes, there's investment and there's consumption, and the people who are presenting work on the research side tend to be looking for feedback, but also just looking to promote the work. And they're looking for the credential of having, or the certification of having made it onto the conference, even if the audience in the room is sometimes fairly small. And so sort of, I think that with the shift to kind of a less travel, more online world, it's not that has necessarily gotten unbundled, but the bundling has just gotten very different. And so one of the things that I feel like I've found, with conference presentations and attendance and travel this year is, the attendance at a session when you're presenting a paper, actually seems to me like it's way up relative to what it's been in the past. I mean, the cost for people to attend, in a sense, the time cost is much lower. At the same time, there are a set of people where kind of, the deal before might have been if they're going to a conference to present a paper, they're then going to sort of also be in the room for other papers. And that, that deal is a little bit out the window now when, it's easier for people to sort of not be there, or, people are at home and they're fitting a conference in among their other regular obligations anyway. And so, I think that interacts in interesting ways with kind of, institutional prestige relationships. And you probably have, some substitution towards having larger audiences, but larger audiences that don't, necessarily always include the same people who have the same range of experience and titles and prestige and seniority in the profession and whatever. And I don't know what's better and what's worse, but it's definitely different. It's definitely, it's different. And I think it will be really, really interesting to see how things evolve when travel becomes more of an option again. People will really have to make decisions about what they want to attend in person and what they want to attend online and what they don't want to attend. I think there's one piece of this, which in my view, a lot of that was kind of complicated and ambiguous. In my view, there's one piece of this, which is sort of unambiguously good, which is every single teacher, scholar, student in our profession, broadly conceived, everyone now has sort of some level of comfort with the idea of doing online interaction, right? Yeah. Everybody's been on Zoom or WebEx. People understand, even if they don't have kind of necessarily the words for it, people understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. They have an intuitive understanding that there are pros and cons to those things. I think since everyone's been in the audience, people have a much greater empathy for the degree to which an online presenter needs to demand attention, and the power of distraction. And so I hope that it leads to a world where everybody is better. Everybody's better as an online presenter, as an online audience member, now than they were a year ago. And everybody's even better 6 months or 12 months from now. And then we're going to figure out how we use this new orientation and these new skills and the new tech. But I love that it's now okay to, you can invite someone to give an online presentation, and they may say no, but they're not going to say no because they think the idea of doing an online presentation is weird or crazy or confusing. And I think that piece of it is not going to go away. I think that's knowledge that we now collectively have built up, and I don't think we're going to lose it.
I agree. I am interested to see how we harness this new innovation. I mean, it's been around, but for us as educators, researchers, it wasn't part of our day-to-day or even semester activities. So we'll see what happens. But, same thing with respect to research, our teaching has totally changed. And you have, if anybody's watching this right now, they already notice a difference with the camera quality. You invest a lot of time. One, why do you invest so much time in figuring out this online thing? And then I also want to know what your advice, or what are the common mistakes you see people making when they're transitioning to online? So these are very loaded questions. Go with it.
No. I love them. So any question about why is, a why question is a causal inference question, and things have lots of causes. So so I'm gonna give at least kind of two explanations for why I am investing the way that I am in trying to do what I would consider sort of high production values. And I want to be clear, you and I know are very much on the same wavelength about this, but in my view, you can be a good or a bad teacher with high or low production values. I think that these things are they're separate. They're not orthogonal, but they're separate. And so, I try to be, a good teacher, and I try to have good production values. And I think they're not, aiming for one helps me succeed at the other. But they're different. So let me give two sort of explanations for why, because your question was why. So the first is kind of a historical, personal history. So and it has to do with my move from ASU to Babson. So I had been on the faculty at ASU, as I mentioned. I gave a research seminar at Babson which was great. I love giving research seminars and I love invitations. And I have family that lives 10 minutes away from Babson campus, and I was already visiting family and had a contact with a now colleague there who said, "Hey, you're going to be in town. We'd love to have you by for lunch and to give a talk." And that they say every presentation is a job talk. It turned out the lunch turned into a talk. The talk turned into a job offer. That job offer was off cycle. It wasn't through a traditional job market process or timing. And because of sort of institutional needs, Babson made me this offer, which was so great. And I was so excited. I love the people. But this was in May of 2019. And they said, we need you to start this fall. And I said, I can't start this fall. I have 2 kids that are in school, and I've in preschool, I've paid tuition. I have a partner who works a full-time job, and we have a house, and we're not ready to move in a few months. And the sort of the solution to threading this needle, because Babson couldn't sort of wait a year, was for me to start teaching at Babson in January. So I taught in the fall at ASU, and then I taught in the spring at Babson. And for me to teach starting in the spring at Babson online only. So this was pre-COVID, but kind of in order to make my move work on the timing that they needed and the timing that I needed, there was this agreement that I could teach my first semester at Babson fully online. And I was thrilled that they had accommodated me this way. And I said, I am going to just do my best to do a great job at this. Like, I don't, they are making a special arrangement, a special accommodation to help me do this. And I want my colleagues to see me do a great job. I want the administration to see me do a great job. I want my students to be thrilled. So I had been teaching face-to-face. I felt, you're always trying to do better, but I felt like I was doing well teaching at ASU, and I had done well, I think, teaching as a grad student as well. And so I was like, I'm going to try to learn how to do a good job of this. And, so I started from zero. This is kind of, December 2019, January 2020. And I was trying to figure out, like, what's the right kind of webcam to get? What's the right kind of microphone to get? How am I going to share slides, but be able to write on them the way that I would like to in the classroom? And there are experts in this stuff. I mean, I am not an expert. And I was trying to learn from experts. And some of those were instructional technology experts, but some of those were also people who were posting, YouTube reviews of what's our favorite webcam or what's our favorite microphone. And so I sort of said, I'm going to try to put this together and do it right. And so I not only had the experience of trying to learn to do a good job with this stuff, but I had the experience of trying to learn to do a good job, having not done it before, wanting to really do it right, and saying, okay, I have like 6 weeks to figure this out and get this stuff together and buy what I need and learn what I need and do it. And then a few weeks after I started my spring classes at Babson, everybody else was trying to figure out the same thing. And so I came to this from the perspective, not of I'm a guy who really knows what I'm doing, but from the perspective of I'm a guy who just spent some time trying to quickly come up to speed and synthesize what I can learn from people who have been thinking about these issues in a deep way for a long time. And having concluded, like, this is the camera to buy, and this is the microphone to buy, and this is the way to think about whatever, let me tell you what I've learned.
You had recently gone through it, so it's easier to share your struggles and what you've learned.
Yes. And the other thing is that my experience trying to read and learn from the expert advice and consensus was that a lot of it was not put together in the way that I found as useful as I would have liked. And I haven't read everything. I haven't talked to everyone. There's many people who are deeply expert in these things and have been thinking about them for an extremely long time. But my feeling as kind of an amateur consumer of advice was that, there was a set of advice for people who were aspiring towards being, let's call them streamers. Largely it was kind of Twitch focused. A lot of it was gaming focused. And so there was a lot of thinking and advice about, how to maximize performance from a computer without having to spend thousands of dollars on a GPU. But also a lot of that was around trying to help people think about how to maximize earnings potential and, get sponsorship on YouTube. And that wasn't, that was a different set of goals. And there was also a lot of really good and really interesting advice from people who are coming from more of a research grounded instructional technology background. And those people are amazing. But I think a lot of what I at least was exposed to coming out of that area of expertise was thinking about people who were basically offering advice for people who were basically thinking about how do I design technology intensive courses from scratch in order to maximize learning.
Yeah.
And that's great, but it's not what I was trying to do. I viewed this as I'm going to be teaching for a semester online and maybe I'll do some online teaching in the future. And I want to do a good job, but I'm not trying to figure out sort of online learning focused instructional design and reorient everything around that modality. I'm trying to figure out where is the low hanging fruit?
Yeah.
Where is the low hanging fruit? So that's, I realize I'm giving a long answer to a short question.
No, this is perfect. I appreciate it.
So that was one whole thing was I want to do a good job and I'm going to read about it. And I had read about it and let me share some of what I've learned. The other part of it is that I'm a little bit of a nerd and I like music and I used to play more music and I used to have a longer commute and I listened to a lot of podcasts and, I've occasionally gotten bit by hobbyist bugs and spent some time thinking about photography and spent some time as a very low grade audiophile, which is the best kind of audiophile to be is liking quality, but not having the money to spend on expensive stuff. And so, I had developed a very amateur taste for, photos and videos that were lit well, audio that sounded good. And I knew from what I was hearing and seeing, I wasn't a student, right? I wasn't taking online classes, but we moved to a world where people were doing more Zoom meetings, more WebEx meetings, more Skype, more whatever. And I was like, this is terrible. Mm-hmm. Sitting in an hour-long faculty meeting, again, pre-COVID, right?
Yeah.
But I was distant from Arizona and all my colleagues were on the ground in Wellesley. And sitting in an hour-long faculty meeting where everybody's in the classroom and I'm on my computer at home listening. And I was like, I can't engage with this easily for an hour. It sounds bad. The visual isn't good. And so, it was really how can I try to give my students, I'm not aiming for a first class experience, but second class would be okay. I just don't want them to feel third class having the online guy in Arizona rather than the on the ground instructor.
It sounds like the motivation was a chip on your shoulder, making sure that, hey, I'm given this opportunity and I want to prove that I am the right person for it, right? Which sometimes is a great motivation, but you took it a little bit further with all the visuals. So what was the first thing that you invested in?
Okay. So the first thing I did was I got a decent webcam, decent, it was a Keo Razor. It's about a $70 webcam.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, it's like the good webcam along with the Logitech. I think it's the C900 series. It's like the good webcam that that I was reading about as a recommendation for, people who want to do audio conferencing or whatever else. and I got kind of a decent USB microphone. It was a USB condenser microphone. And I read about putting it on a boom arm so that I could get it close to my mouth. And a boom arm is basically like this. And the cheap ones are about $13.
Great
and let you get the mic right up close to your mouth. And so that was where I started, was with those two things. And I already had like a decent work computer, but Babson has a very cool program where they issue like a standard laptop to every faculty member, and also every student gets the same laptop. So part of what Babson students sort of, they pay tuition, of course, but everybody gets the same computer, and it's owned by the school. The students basically borrow it or rent it. And that also provides a lot of efficiency around tech support and infrastructure and whatever. But it meant I had two computers, because I had my Babson computer and my work computer. And I was like, okay, well, I've got one I can use for the calling, and I can use my Babson computer to do slides and annotation. And I've got this mic, and I've got the camera. And then things escalated a little bit from there. They escalated a little bit from there. But they actually, they haven't escalated as much as it perhaps looks like, or hopefully looks like. So, I am doing most of this stuff out of pocket. Some of this is reimbursed out of my research budget, but I put a $50 lens on my camera. So I'm not using that webcam anymore. I have a standalone camera now, but I put a $50 lens on the camera, and I think it looks good, and I like the quality, but it's kind of, the good lens was, $300 or $400. And I sort of said, I'm in for $50, but that's kind of, what I'm in for a lens that's basically going to be my videography lens. Yeah. And so, one of the things I've been conscious of as I've been giving more advice to people, which is through Twitter and through some other stuff that I've, tried to share and post online, is, I've gotten bitten by the gear acquisition syndrome bug a little bit. And I like it, and I have fun with it. But, part of this is a hobby for me. And I want to give people advice and help them and be a resource without trying to imply or suggest to anyone that they need to go down this rabbit hole in anything like the way that I have. And that's part of the reason that I try really hard to just, beat the drum about the small number of things that I think are really important on the tech side. So there's a ton that's really important on the pedagogy side. And that's, again, a place where I try to do well, but that's, I'm not an expert there. But, I think, for example, and we've talked about this and I've posted about this many times, I think a microphone is the one thing that everybody needs. And it's really hard for me to understand. Well, it's also hard for me to understand what people are saying through a crappy microphone, but it's really hard for me to understand the sort of resistance to spending a little bit of money and a little bit of tech hassle for somebody to sound decent when they're asking someone to listen to them for 5 or 15 or 60 or 90 minutes at a time.
Audio is the usually cheapest and easiest way to improve drastically the quality of your videos, your communication. And, sometimes it doesn't even take a microphone. You could use your computer microphones or phone microphone to improve it. Just don't use the built-in microphone, because that picks up a lot of sound and a lot of vibrations. And then the next thing is video, but there's a lot of extremes with it with respect to video quality.
I have, I wound up in for, and I have links to exactly what all this gear is that's online. And we can probably include with the episode link, but I'm in for kind of a $250 camera which is a camera that was probably $400 when it was new, but I bought it when it was already discontinued. So I tend to try to buy kind of cheap, good enough stuff. And, on video, I'm in for a $250 camera and a $50 lens. And then this like $300 video switcher, which is called an A10 Mini. And it's your recommendation that put me on to the A10 Mini. And it's, I would say that's a thing that appeals more to my hobbyist mentality. I really like it a lot. I like that it lets me do things like video overlays. And, I try to do, when I'm doing sync stuff, more for conferences or external video meetings rather than just teaching classes. But I like being able to press buttons to do things like lower thirds or, other stuff that I get to use this for. But that's like really, I almost don't even like to talk about that on Twitter or LinkedIn because I really like, I realize that, you add up those numbers and you're at $600 for the camera. And all of a sudden, that's an investment, and it's an investment of money, but it's also an investment in, there's a lot of cables and there's a lot of outlets, and it just becomes complicated.
Know-how. Yeah.
We talked, you mentioned earlier this article that Nick posted this morning about kind of whether academics are content creators and whether academics should be content creators. And my view is that academics can be, and some should be, content creators.
Yes.
And
I agree.
that the article, which we can also include a link to, which I think was good and thought provoking, where I think it kind of overstated its case was in the argument that there was something antithetical to the idea of the university about, chopping lectures up into bite-sized pieces or aiming for high, sort of YouTube quality production standards on the video side. And I think that is an important thing. I think we have to, change with the times. And I think what we're going to do, we should try to do a good job of.
Yeah.
That said, like, I don't really see myself as aiming to be a content creator. I think it's great that it's happening. I think it needs to happen. I actually wish more people would do it. Yeah. And so for example, I have been recording, pre-work videos to use in not exactly a flipped classroom model, but, I've been trying to record more asynchronous recorded content for some of my classes this year. I would love to rely on more high quality content like that I hadn't recorded. Yeah. I think I have a comparative advantage in this relative to many people, but like, I'm not editing my videos. I'm not scripting them. I don't have a teleprompter. I'm not like, you go see what some of the high quality content looks like. There's good stuff, really good stuff that's come out of a variety of places. But if you think about the MOOC developers, if you think about something like Marginal Revolution University, if you think about some stuff that's come out of textbook publishers, although some of that is also very low quality, like, I don't want to be doing that myself.
But you have to in some situations.
But you have to. And if I'm going to do it, like, if I'm going to record myself for an hour and make that into 4 15-minute videos, I'd rather use a good camera and look good. But I'm not aiming to do that at the standard of someone who really has to compete for attention. I think someone should, but I'm not trying. I will try to compete for my students' attention relative to all of the distraction that they have in their lives. But I am not trying to, like, I'm not posting my course videos on YouTube and trying to be, the guy who's going to talk about how to calculate a net present value. I just don't think that's my skill and my strength.
So I have a couple of things to add here, and I'm going to take a little hot take over here. Might get crucified for it, but from my standpoint, academia is no different than content creation. It's just what we're creating is a different. I mean, research is content creation, right? It's a different model, it's a different audience. And then when it comes to teaching, the issue that I have with the article, I understand that, not everybody wants to be mainstream, but I don't think that's why we're in education. The issue that I had with the article that was shared today is it assumed that innovations in teaching is marginalizing the role of academia, right? And to me, that's one of the reasons that we are in the position we are in today is academia has been slow to take on some of these new innovations from industry. And I'll just share with you the reason why I have invested heavily in online content creation.
Mm-hmm.
It's because when I went to, the pandemic hits, I'm on sabbatical when it hits, and I'm thinking about how do I teach a class online fully synchronous or asynchronous, and I'm learning this language as we go. But the environment, the mainstream language is online education is not valuable. It's not going to do as good of a job as in-person education. So we're already battling. It's kind of like your transition to Babson. There was this assumption that, hey, I have to show that I am bringing value. So I wanted to show that I was bringing value to the classroom because this Zoom lecture was not, people didn't perceive it positively.
Mm-hmm.
And in my effort to find content out there so I don't have to create my own content, one of the biggest issues that I saw, and this is a diversity, inclusion, and equity conversation, is nobody that's creating economic content looks like Abdullah Al-Barani, right? And in the world where the market is thinking that teachers are not teaching, they're just curating content and letting students learn by themselves, I felt like that would add to that conversation. So I felt the pressure to create my own content. And like you, I have hobbies around, audio and video. And I said, if I'm going to do it, let me try to do it right. And honestly, my motivation was YouTube content creators,
Mm-hmm.
because the thought process there is YouTube is competition to education. And if that's the case, why compete with it? Why not just belong in that environment?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's where my students are going, how can I create content or educational lessons that is in line with what they're already consuming? So we could look at it and say, hey, we don't want to be that. But at the same time, the environment is changing. And how are we going to innovate? And there's been more reluctance to innovation. And, to go back to your statement about the adding pressure for faculty to buy all of this stuff, I'm very conscious about that as well. Just because I have the hobby of, the lights and the cameras,
Mm-hmm.
to do good online video content and classroom content, there has to be an investment. And what I would like to see is more investment from the administration standpoint. Just like we have research budgets or travel budgets or teaching budgets, there has to be a budget allocated to teching up, right? And teaching people how to tech up and use that technology. So the pressure to create content has been a catalyst for me to create the content.
I think that's a really useful perspective for me to hear about. And I mean, everything you're saying resonates for me. I think that there's, so in my view, the role that kind of reusable asynchronous content plays is actually very different from the role that that sort of high quality technology intermediated synchronous interaction plays.
Well said.
And I think that, there's a lot of overlap in terms of skills. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the tech that's involved. But I think that there should be a different level of individual and institutional investment in and reward for those two things. And, in my view is kind of, the former, the sort of reusable asynchronous content, it's not the same as kind of a 21st century version of the textbook, but that's a little bit, how I think about at least some of that content. It's,
Same here.
when I was an undergrad, I had a lot of classes where it was, before our next class, read and review chapter 23 and, work through practice problems 1, 7, 9, and 11. And, that model of using a written textbook as the source of, asynchronous engagement, doesn't seem to work, or at least it doesn't seem to work as well. And, why? That question's kind of above my pay grade a little bit. How much of that is about a difference in the types of distractions that are available, the sophistication of the student as a consumer of high quality media, how much of that is about what's happened to the price of textbooks and therefore students' willingness to invest in, in getting them and having. I think there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. But there have always been kind of a smaller number of people who write the textbooks and a larger number of people who teach the textbooks. And I feel very comfortable with the idea that there could be a smaller number of people who generate and record, the high quality asynchronous content. And there absolutely should be attention paid and commitment to making sure that those voices are diverse, that those voices are contemporary, that content is engaging and, modern. But I don't know that everyone should feel that they have to do that themselves. I do think that in a world, and I think we're going to live in this world for a while, I think that in a world where at least some significant part of the classroom experience involves, a student who's online and or an instructor who's online. And also, this is also true for, research presentations and other types of presentations. But, the presenter is on a computer and or some significant part of the audience is on a computer. That everyone needs to do it. And so what we need to figure out collectively is how can we ensure that, that nobody is doing a bad job at that. I would love for everybody to do, an awesome job of it.
Yeah.
But I think part of the way that we, and I say we now, not just we, the whole profession, but we, you and I, and, the smaller set of people who are interested in working to execute on that goal, I think there's kind of at least two different things we can do. One is we can try to do a really excellent job of it ourselves to try to serve as models for people of like, I don't mean to sound immodest, but like, this is what's possible, right? We're not going to be the best in the world, but we're going to try to do a good enough job that it feels like people have models of what to learn from and what to aspire towards. But the other thing that I think we can do is we can just try to help people get empathy for how bad the experience is when it's bad, so that people can try to go from bad to good. Like, it's great to show people what great looks like, but I think we also have to show people a little bit more of what bad looks like so that they can avoid it. And this is like another hobby horse of mine. So I hope you will indulge my.
I'm with you.
One of my hobby horses is audio quality. I just think it's crazy that people use some of the microphones they use and they get really far away from them and nobody can hear what they're saying anymore. And then they get closer and you can hear them again. And it's like, come on. Another one of my hobby horses is about what we in the academy do around giving people feedback on their teaching.
Yeah.
And I think it's a scandal. I think it's absolutely scandalous. I ran a poll on Twitter a couple of months ago. Super informal. Like this isn't for science. This was just for curiosity. So I did a poll and I asked people how many times since you started teaching online has anyone who's not one of your students observed your class? Like giving you any feedback as an observer on your class. And, I think I said, 2 or more times, 1 time, 0, and I would like someone to do it, or 0, and I would not like someone to do it. And, the modal answer was, 0, and I don't want anyone to do it.
Oh, wow.
It is, I think it's a scandal. We have been teaching online for a year, and it is literally a 30-minute ask to have a colleague spend 15 minutes visiting one of your online classes, and then 15 minutes talking with you about it later. Like, what was good? What did they not like? The degree to which people are not seeing what the student experience looks like because they're not observing others' classes, and the degree to which people are not getting feedback on what the experience of being a student in their class is like, to me, is an absolute scandal. And so, what I would say to your audience, and unfortunately, your audience is almost certainly not the people who need to hear this. But what, my ask for every department chair, would be set up a non-evaluative feedback system where you ask every faculty member in your department to spend 30 minutes or 45 minutes or 60 minutes observing 2 or 3 or 4 classes online in your department, and then spends 30 or 45 or 60 minutes giving some feedback to the instructor of that class. You can even kind of do this yourself if you watch the video recordings of your own class. I didn't poll it. I am willing to bet that 10% or less of college faculty members have watched a full class recording of their own class. I mean, nobody does it.
I've learned a lot about myself just editing my videos, just tendencies and times you think you're clear, but you're like, what did I just say? Right? It's just not clear. The one thing that I will do is I'll link to teaching evaluation or colleague evaluation form that I've used in the past and I like. So if anybody's interested, they could take a look at it.
And I should say, like, we have done this in my department at Babson. My department chair has organized it. It is non-evaluative. But he's basically, he's helped create a system where, anyone who wants to have someone come and observe their class and then give them feedback. This is specifically, online teaching. And, I've done it, and it's great. Like, you learn from having someone visit your class and talk with you about it. You probably learn even more from visiting someone else's class, because you get to see a little bit about what that student experience is like. And we think that we have some idea around, because we're all in faculty meetings or we're all in other kinds of meetings and whatever, but, to kind of really see what it's like to be a student in one of these classes, one of these online classes, it's a real learning experience.
Luke, one of my goals was to learn more about what your students observe from your classroom, but we've already hit the plus 60-minute experience. We would have to probably redo this with another intention. But I really do appreciate your time. This was a lot of fun.
I loved this conversation, and I apologize. I apologize if I was kind of went on too long about some things, so we didn't get to talk about everything else.
No, not at all. This is exactly what this my intentions are with this show or episodes, is to amplify the work that's being done across the country, across institutions that I find interesting, but I think other people need to hear. So I really appreciate your time, your feedback, and send over any links that you have. We'll put it in the description of the
I absolutely
channel.
will. And thank you for organizing this today. But more than that, I've really learned a lot and enjoyed, getting to learn from the variety of different things that you're doing. And so that includes this video series. But, in case not everyone in your audience knows, Abdullah is not only running this Coffee with Dr. A video series and other video content on his YouTube page, but also has a complementary online presence in other social channels. And I've had fun seeing what you're doing on Instagram stories and seeing what, of course, you're doing on Twitter, which is where we initially connected. We talked earlier about scholars, teachers, researchers as kind of content creators. And I think that was a useful and a rich discussion. But I think there's also a way in which part of what some of us are trying to do is to kind of build a brand, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think there's probably some people in our profession who might kind of feel a little bit skeeved out by the idea that a professor might try to build a brand around what? I don't know, around our teaching, around our online presence, around our research. But I actually think that it's, I think it's really, really valuable. And I've learned a lot from you about seeing, how you're doing that. And so thank you. And to anyone in the audience who hasn't sort of, I don't want to sound like I'm shilling for your social media channels, because it's not that I think you need more followers to have more followers, but I think that there is a lot for a lot of us to learn about, how to more effectively communicate and market the things that we're doing anyway. And given we're already doing a lot of that stuff anyway, marketing it may kind of be low-hanging fruit and helping it find the right audience. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just to summarize it, my views are that we're all creating research. We have something that we're passionate about. How do we reach as many people with what we're passionate about and influence, their thoughts or their views or their research? So with that said, Luke, thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you on Twitter.
You will. Thank you again.
Great. See you.